The house had always been a place of warmth, light, and a touch of Hollywood glamour. Teri Garr had lived there for years, in the heart of the Los Angeles hills, a serene refuge from the bustling city below. It was the kind of home that echoed with memories of the many roles she'd played, the laughter, the tears, the fame, and the quiet solitude. When she passed away, her death left behind not just the actress, but an energy that seemed to linger in the walls of the house. It wasn't long before the home was sold to a young couple, Rachel and David Williams. They had always dreamed of living in this part of town, drawn to its history and charm. They moved in quickly, enchanted by the open spaces, the grand oak floors, and the view that stretched across the hills. It was everything they had hoped for. At first, it felt perfect. The house was everything they wanted: peaceful, spacious, and bright. But soon after settling in, strange things started to happen. It began with the music. Soft, almost imperceptible melodies, tunes from the 60s and 70s, songs that were long out of style, would float through the air at odd hours of the day. David would be sitting in the living room, reading, and the sound of a piano would drift from the upstairs. Or Rachel would be in the kitchen, and suddenly, the hum of a violin would fill the room. The couple checked every speaker, every radio, even the TV, but found nothing. The music was coming from nowhere. The lights would flicker at random, always in a pattern that felt deliberate, like someone was playing with them. The shadows in the corners of their vision never seemed to stay still. At first, they thought it was just their imagination, the newness of the house making them feel on edge. But it wasn't just their minds playing tricks. One evening, after a long day of work, Rachel was alone in the living room when she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye. A figure, just a shadow, moving across the hallway. She stood still, her heart racing, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. The shadow was gone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was there. David had his own experiences. One night, while in the bathroom, he swore he saw a woman's reflection in the mirror, standing behind him. When he turned around, the bathroom was empty. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It wasn't just the house, it felt as though the very air was thick with memories, with a presence that refused to leave. The couple knew they had to confront it. They began researching the house, hoping to find something, anything that could explain the strange happenings. That's when they learned more about Teri Garr's life there, her deep love for the home, and how it had always been her sanctuary. She had described it in interviews as a happy house, a place of peace and creativity. But now, to Rachel and David, it felt more like a place where the past refused to fade. They reached out to a medium, hoping for some clarity. The woman who arrived was calm, with an air of certainty that made Rachel and David uneasy yet hopeful. She moved through the house with purpose, her eyes flicking toward the corners, the doorways, the windows. "The energy here is strong," the medium said, her voice soft but firm. "Teri is here. She's not ready to leave, not yet. She loved this place too much." Rachel and David were taken aback. The medium explained that sometimes, when someone is deeply attached to a place, their spirit lingers, caught between the world of the living and the world of the dead. It wasn't that Teri wanted to haunt them, it was simply that she couldn't let go of what had been hers for so long. The medium suggested a ceremony, something small, intimate, a way to acknowledge Teri's spirit and give her permission to move on. Rachel and David agreed. They gathered candles, photographs, and some of Teri's work, a symbol of the life she had lived there, and the home she had loved so much. They spoke aloud, telling Teri that they respected her, that they appreciated the memories she had left behind, but that they wanted to live in peace, too. The ceremony was quiet, almost like a prayer, and when it was done, the air in the house seemed to change. The flickering lights stopped. The music ceased. The shadows no longer danced in the corners of their vision. Days passed and the house grew still. The couple had their home back, the peace they had hoped for restored. But they couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the spirit that had once lived there, Teri Garr, who had left behind not just a house, but a legacy. And for the first time, Rachel and David truly felt that the house was happy again. Not haunted, Not trapped but filled with memories that would never be forgotten. The days grew longer as Rachel and David settled into the rhythm of life in Teri Garr's old home. The strange occurrences that had plagued them in the early weeks seemed to have faded, but the house itself still felt alive in a way they hadn't anticipated. There was a subtle pulse, an undercurrent of energy that lingered in the air, a quiet hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls, the floors, the very earth beneath the house. It wasn't unsettling anymore, at least not in the way it had been. The music had stopped, the shadows had become less intrusive, and the flickering lights had ceased. But something was still there, something that refused to be forgotten. The house was expansive, with rooms that seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one with its own unique charm. The living room had high ceilings, crowned with beams that had been there for decades, perhaps even longer. The light that streamed through the tall French windows cast long, golden rays that painted the walls with soft, shifting patterns. It was the sort of room that made you feel like you could breathe deeper, think clearer, almost as though the space itself encouraged you to let go of everything that weighed you down. It was in that room that Rachel first noticed the subtle presence again. One evening, she found herself sitting by the large stone fireplace, a book in her lap, but her attention drifting away from the pages. The flames crackled and popped, sending tendrils of heat that swirled in the cool air of the early evening. She had become accustomed to the quiet beauty of the house, the way it hummed with a gentle pulse, but tonight, there was something different, something more pronounced. As she sat there, the faintest scent of perfume reached her nose, something floral, almost like jasmine, but older, richer, as though it had been carried through time itself. She froze, the book in her hands now forgotten, as her mind swam with the realization that the scent was not coming from any flowers nearby. She scanned the room, her eyes resting on the antique furniture that lined the walls, the soft velvet cushions, the polished wooden tables, but it was all still. No movement, no sudden shift, just the lingering smell. Rachel stood up, almost hesitantly, as if the house itself were watching her. She walked over to the French doors that led out to the patio, her footsteps silent on the smooth, cool floor. The wind was picking up outside, rustling the leaves of the tall trees in the garden. The patio lights flickered softly, casting long shadows that danced on the stone steps. As she stepped outside, the night air felt heavy, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. The scent of jasmine seemed to follow her, growing stronger, until she could almost feel it wrapping around her, holding her there, in the space between the living and the dead. David had been in his study, working late into the night as he often did, but when Rachel returned to the house, he immediately noticed the change in her demeanor. Her usually composed face was now clouded with something he couldn't quite place: uncertainty, perhaps, or a quiet wonder. She looked at him, her gaze distant, as though she were seeing him from across a great distance. "Rachel!" His voice was soft, filled with concern. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the large windows in the living room, her fingers lightly brushing the cool glass. The night outside stretched on in darkness, the stars twinkling faintly above. She looked out, her expression unreadable, before she finally spoke. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David frowned, standing up from his desk. He wasn't sure what she meant, but the way she asked it made something stir within him. The house had always been more than just a home to him. It had felt like something alive, something watching, waiting. But he had pushed that feeling aside, trying to focus on the simple beauty of the place. But now, standing there in the dim light, he wasn't so sure. "Feel what?" he asked, moving toward her. Rachel turned to face him, her eyes wide, searching. "It's like there's someone here. Not in a bad way, but in a way that makes it impossible to forget. It's like the house has memories of its own memories that want to be remembered." David stared at her for a long moment, considering her words. He knew she wasn't imagining things. But what could it all mean? They had held the ceremony, hadn't they? They had acknowledged Teri Garr's spirit, paid their respects. Why did it feel like something was still lingering in the air, hanging over them like a delicate fog? The days that followed were quieter, but there was an undeniable tension that seemed to fill the corners of the rooms, the hallways, the very spaces between them. David began to spend more time in the study, where the light was dimmer and the air thicker, heavier with the weight of old wood and leather-bound books. Rachel, on the other hand, found herself drawn more often to the upstairs, particularly the master bedroom. It was a room that had once been Teri's sanctuary, a place where she had rested, dreamed, and perhaps reflected on the roles she had played, the life she had led. The room was spacious, with a tall, ornate bed frame that stood proudly against the far wall, the intricate carvings of roses and vines winding their way around the posts. The large windows let in a flood of light during the day, casting the room in a soft, golden glow, but at night, it felt different, almost too still, almost too silent. One evening, Rachel sat in the armchair by the window, her legs tucked beneath her, staring out at the twinkling city lights far below. The house was still, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards or the distant hum of a passing car on the road below. But then, as she sat there, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound footsteps. At first, she thought it might be David, coming to check on her. But when she turned, she saw no one. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, echoing faintly across the hardwood floor. It was then that she realized the sound was coming from inside the walls. The house, it seemed, had its own heartbeat, and it was beginning to stir once again. As Rachel tried to shake off the growing unease, David, too, began to sense the shift. He had never believed in ghosts, never really entertained the idea of spirits or hauntings. But now, with each passing day, he found it harder to dismiss the strange occurrences, the flickering lights, the soft hum in the air, the sense of being watched, even when no one was around. The house, it seemed, was not ready to let them go. And neither was Teri Garr. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Rachel sat in the armchair by the window for what felt like an eternity, staring out into the vast expanse of the city lights below. She felt a gnawing unease settle deep in her chest, an unsettling sensation that she couldn't shake. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faintest creak of the floorboards. At first, she assumed it was just the house settling, a natural occurrence that came with age and the shifting of wood. But the sound didn't stop. The steps, slow, deliberate, seemed to echo through the house, as though someone or something was walking just outside her sight line. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stood up abruptly, her heart racing. The air in the room felt colder now, almost as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. She glanced toward the door, half expecting to see David standing there, but the hallway outside remained empty, cloaked in darkness. The footsteps continued, their rhythm steady and unhurried, but now they were unmistakably coming from inside the walls just behind her, as though someone were moving through the very structure of the house itself. Trembling, Rachel crossed the room toward the door and opened it cautiously, her eyes searching the dimly lit hallway. The silence that greeted her was thick, oppressive. She stepped out into the corridor, her footsteps barely making a sound on the old wooden floors. There was no one there. The house stood still, as though it were holding its breath. She turned and walked toward the staircase, drawn by the strange pull of something she couldn't understand, something that had been slowly creeping into her awareness since the day she and David had moved in. Upstairs, the atmosphere was different. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if it carried the weight of years, of lives lived in the space before hers. She stepped into the master bedroom, the room that had once been Teri Garr's sanctuary, a place where the actress had found moments of solitude and peace amid the chaos of her career. The room was still, save for the soft rustling of the curtains, which fluttered gently in the cool evening breeze. The light from the street lamps outside cast long shadows across the room, stretching across the bed, the floor, the walls. Rachel walked toward the bed, her fingers grazing the delicate embroidered fabric of the bedspread. The scent of jasmine was faint in the air now, but still present, lingering like a memory that refused to fade. As Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, the house seemed to sigh. The walls seemed to groan, a low, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to reverberate through her bones. It wasn't the kind of noise you would expect from an old house, but something far deeper, something ancient. She closed her eyes, letting the feeling wash over her, trying to push aside the creeping sense of dread that had begun to settle in her chest. But as she opened her eyes, the room seemed different. The shadows seemed longer now, stretching unnaturally across the floor, as though they were reaching for her. And then she saw it. In the corner of the room, near the large window that overlooked the garden, a figure stood. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light or maybe her mind playing games with her. But the figure remained motionless, standing in the dark corner as though it were waiting for something. It was tall, its form indistinct, shrouded in shadow. Rachel blinked, and when she opened her eyes again, the figure was still there. Her breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to call out to David, but no sound came. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was pressing in on her, making it impossible to move. The figure shifted slightly, just enough for Rachel to see the outline of a face, pale and haunting, almost as if it were a reflection of the past. The features were faint, almost translucent, like a memory that had not fully formed. The figure's eyes were dark, hollow, but they locked onto hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. In that moment, time seemed to stretch, to warp around her. The house was alive in a way she had never imagined, as though it were a living, breathing entity, and the figure, whoever it was a part of it. A part of something much larger than she could comprehend. With a start, Rachel blinked again, and the figure was gone, as though it had melted into the shadows. The room was still. The air was still. But the weight of the presence remained, hanging in the space between her and the world outside. She stood up, her heart hammering in her chest, and backed away from the corner where the figure had stood. She turned quickly, her feet stumbling slightly on the plush carpet, and rushed out of the room, nearly colliding with the hallway wall as she made her way down the stairs. David was sitting in the living room. As she had left him, his attention focused on his laptop. He didn't look up when she entered, but the moment he saw the look on her face, his expression changed. There was no mistaking the fear in her eyes, the way her body trembled as though she had been shaken by something she couldn't explain. "Rachel, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing, but the words wouldn't come. She shook her head, her mind racing, trying to process what she had just seen. The figure, the shadow, it was as real as anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't just a dream or a trick of the light, it had been there, in the room with her. Rachel's voice cracked, and she cleared her throat, trying to speak more clearly. "I saw something. In the bedroom. It was like a person, but not really. It was like a shadow, but it had a face. And its eyes, David. Its eyes, they were so dark, so hollow. It was like it was watching me." David frowned, setting his laptop aside. He stood up, moving toward her, his brow furrowing with concern. "Are you sure? Maybe it was just a trick of the light or—" "No," Rachel interrupted, shaking her head. "I'm not imagining this. It was real, David. It was real." There was a long pause, and David studied her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt, but finding none. The tension in the air between them was palpable. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be fine, that it was all in her head, but something in the pit of his stomach told him otherwise. The house, this place that had once been filled with so much warmth and creativity, now felt darker, heavier, as if the past was reaching out to them, unwilling to let go. Rachel sank into the couch, burying her face in her hands, trying to shake the image from her mind. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just some fleeting moment. The presence in the room, the shadowy figure, it was part of the house itself, a manifestation of something older, something tied to the very foundations of the home. David sat down beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "We need to find out more about this place, Rachel, about what happened here. Maybe there's something we're missing." Rachel nodded, though the thought of delving deeper into the history of the house made her uneasy. But she knew that they couldn't keep running from whatever this was. The house had secrets, and it was only a matter of time before they were forced to uncover them, whether they were ready or not. Rachel and David spent the next few days digging into the history of the house, scouring old newspaper articles and reaching out to local historians. What they found only deepened their sense of unease. Teri Garr had indeed loved the house, but she wasn't the first to inhabit it. The property had once belonged to an artist, a reclusive man who had passed away under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed his spirit had never left, that he had been a man obsessed with capturing fleeting moments' memories, faces, emotions, and that his work had been imbued with a strange energy. As Rachel and David pieced together the fragments of the house's past, they learned that the energy in the home was never just Teri's. It was a collection of memories, moments, and people, all bound to the place in a way that couldn't be severed. They realized that the spirit they had felt wasn't a single presence but a collection of energies, of stories and histories that refused to fade. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, Rachel sat in the living room, looking out the window once more. She could feel the weight of everything that had happened, everything the house had witnessed. But something had changed. The shadows no longer seemed threatening. The figures in the corners of her vision felt less like intruders and more like echoes of a time long past, reminders of lives lived and lost. David joined her, sitting quietly beside her. They didn't need to speak. They both understood now. The house, its history, its spirits, they weren't there to haunt them. They were there to remind them that life, in all its beauty and sorrow, left traces behind, and sometimes, those traces lingered in places that had been loved, long after the people who had loved them were gone. The house, they realized, wasn't haunted, it was alive, in its own way, filled with the memories of those who had made it their home. And now it was theirs too. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.